June 6, 1945. The war in the Pacific still raged, but in a remote corner of West Texas, something extraordinary was unfolding behind barbed wire fences. At a makeshift prisoner of war facility outside Fort Stockton, 38 Japanese women stood at morning roll call when they noticed something that made them freeze in confusion and fear. Along the fence posts that marked the perimeter of their compound, delicate desert roses had been placed overnight, their red and pink petals vivid against the harsh landscape. The women exchanged nervous glances, wondering if this was some kind of American trick or mockery. In their military training, they had been taught to expect cruelty from their captors, to prepare for interrogation and humiliation. But flowers? No one had prepared them for flowers. 24-year-old Keiko Yamamoto approached the nearest fence post cautiously, her hands trembling as she reached toward the rose that had been carefully wedged between the wire and wood. She had served as a communications specialist for the Imperial Japanese Navy, intercepting Allied transmissions until her capture in the Philippines 4 months earlier. Everything she had been taught about Americans told her they were barbaric enemies without honor or mercy. Yet, here was a rose, placed with obvious care, its stem wrapped in damp cloth to keep it fresh in the desert heat. Behind her, the other women whispered among themselves in hushed Japanese, their voices carrying equal measures of bewilderment and suspicion. Some suggested it might be poisoned. Others wondered if it was a test of their discipline and loyalty. A few simply stared at the flowers with expressions that revealed a deeper longing, a homesickness for the gentler aspects of life they had left behind when they put on their military uniforms. From the guard tower, Private Jake Martinez watched the women's reactions with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The 20-year-old cowboy from a Mexican-American ranching family had been the first to leave a rose, inspired by memories of his grandmother, who always said that flowers could speak when words failed. He had not expected his simple gesture to spark a movement among the other ranch hands who served as guards, men who had begun to see these enemy prisoners not as monsters, but as young women far from home, caught in circumstances beyond their control. What could possibly bridge the chasm between enemies separated by language, culture, and a brutal war that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides? Before we discover how these unlikely connections transformed both captors and captives, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. The story begins 7 months earlier, when the first transport of Japanese women prisoners arrived in the Texas desert, and no one, least of all the women themselves, could have imagined what awaited them. November 19, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of the hastily constructed facility as the Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the flat, endless landscape. Inside the covered vehicle, 38 Japanese women sat in rigid silence, their faces carefully composed masks that revealed nothing of the fear and uncertainty churning beneath the surface. They had traveled for 3 weeks from the Philippines, transferred through multiple holding facilities, processed and reprocessed until they had become numbers in a system none of them fully understood. Keiko Yamamoto pressed her hand against the small jade pendant hidden beneath her uniform, a gift from her mother that she had somehow managed to keep through multiple searches and inspections. It was the only physical connection she had left to her family in Yokohama, a city she had not heard from in 8 months. As the truck came to a halt and the canvas flap was pulled back, the women were confronted with a landscape so alien it might as well have been another planet. The camp consisted of a dozen wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences, with guard towers at each corner. Beyond the fences stretched an endless expanse of scrubland and distant mesas, so different from the lush islands and coastal cities most of them called home. Commander Colonel Robert Harrison stood waiting for them, flanked by several guards who looked nothing like the professional soldiers the women had expected. These men wore a mixture of military uniforms and civilian clothes, many sporting worn cowboy hats and boots that spoke of lives spent working ranches rather than military bases. The guard shortage had forced the Army to recruit local ranchers and their sons to staff this remote facility, men who knew more about cattle and horses than they did about prisoners of war. Through a translator, Colonel Harrison delivered his welcome speech with mechanical efficiency. The women would be housed in Barracks 3 and 4. They would follow strict schedules for meals, work assignments, and recreation time. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Any attempt to escape would be met with appropriate force. The words washed over Keiko without truly registering. She was focused on the faces of their guards, trying to read threat or mercy in expressions weathered by sun and wind. One young guard in particular caught her attention, a dark-haired man who looked barely older than her younger brother. He met her gaze briefly before looking away, and in that moment, she saw something unexpected: discomfort, perhaps even sympathy. As the women were led toward their barracks, they passed close to the fence line where wild desert flowers grew in stubborn patches, their bright colors defiant against the harsh environment. Keiko found herself drawn to their beauty, these small living things that thrived where everything else seemed barren. She did not know then that these flowers would become symbols of something none of them could yet imagine: the possibility of growth in the most unlikely soil. The first weeks at Fort Stockton passed in a blur of mechanical routine and watchful silence. The Japanese women moved through their days like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, and always in hushed Japanese that their guards could not understand. They maintained the military discipline that had been drilled into them, standing at attention during roll calls, keeping their barracks immaculately organized, and executing their assigned tasks with precision that bordered on defiance. Keiko had been assigned to the camp laundry, along with 7 other women. They spent their days washing uniforms and linens in large metal tubs, their hands growing raw from the harsh soap and constant immersion in water. The work was mindless and exhausting, which suited her fine. It left little energy for thinking about what might be happening to her family back home, or what future, if any, awaited her when this war finally ended. The language barrier created an invisible wall that was sometimes more impenetrable than the barbed wire fences. The guards would issue instructions through gestures and simple English words, growing frustrated when the women stared at them with blank expressions. Some guards dealt with this frustration through increased strictness, barking orders more loudly, as if volume could somehow bridge the gap of understanding. Others simply gave up on communication altogether, pointing and expecting obedience without explanation. Private Jake Martinez found himself in the latter category, though his silence came from uncertainty rather than indifference. He had grown up speaking both English and Spanish in his home, understanding what it meant to navigate between two worlds. He watched the Japanese women with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, seeing in their rigid postures and carefully neutral expressions something he recognized from his own grandmother, an immigrant who had learned to make herself small and unobtrusive in a country that did not always welcome her. The women kept to themselves during mealtimes, sitting at tables in the far corner of the mess hall, eating the unfamiliar American food with chopsticks they had fashioned from wooden scraps. They ate in silence, their eyes downcast, creating a bubble of isolation even in the crowded room. Some of the male guards found this behavior insulting, interpreting their silence as arrogance or contempt. But Sergeant Thomas Blackwater, a Navajo man who had served as a code talker in the Pacific, recognized it for what it truly was: a shield, a way of maintaining dignity and identity in a situation where everything else had been stripped away. At night, Keiko would lie awake in her bunk, listening to the muffled sounds of crying from other women who waited until darkness to release their grief. She clutched her jade pendant and thought about the moment she had been captured, the chaos and terror of that day, the certainty that she would be executed immediately. Instead, she had ended up here, in this strange desert prison, surrounded by enemies who seemed almost as uncomfortable with the situation as she was. The distance between captor and captive seemed vast and unbridgeable, a chasm that neither side knew how to cross. December 3, 1944. The temperature had dropped significantly as winter settled over the Texas desert, and the women had been issued additional blankets and warmer clothing. It was during the morning recreation period that Jake Martinez first noticed Keiko standing near the fence line, her fingers wrapped around the wire as she stared at a cluster of wild desert roses growing just beyond her reach. He had been assigned to patrol the perimeter, a duty that involved walking the fence line and ensuring no one attempted escape or received contraband from outside. But as he approached the section where Keiko stood, he found himself slowing his pace, observing her with an attention that went beyond standard guard procedure. Her face had lost the rigid mask she wore during roll call and work assignments. In this moment, she looked younger, more vulnerable, her expression revealing a longing that transcended language and nationality. She was simply a young woman looking at flowers, perhaps remembering gardens from home, perhaps mourning the beauty that war had stolen from her life. Jake thought about his grandmother's garden back in Del Rio, how she had coaxed roses to bloom in soil that seemed too harsh to support such delicate beauty. His abuela always said that flowers were prayers made visible, that they reminded people of what was worth fighting for even in the darkest times. He had thought her words were just the romantic notions of an old woman, but watching Keiko's face as she gazed at those wild roses, he began to understand what his grandmother had meant. That evening, after his shift ended, Jake rode his horse out into the desert with a knife and a piece of damp cloth. He found a cluster of the desert roses growing near an outcropping of rocks, their petals deep red against the fading light. He cut the stem of the most perfect bloom, wrapped it carefully in the wet cloth, and tucked it into his saddlebag. The next morning, before dawn, he approached the fence line where he had seen Keiko standing. With hands that trembled slightly, he wedged the rose between the fence post and wire, positioning it so that it would be visible during morning roll call. He had no clear idea what he hoped to accomplish with this gesture. He certainly had not thought through the potential consequences if his commanding officer discovered he was leaving gifts for enemy prisoners. But something in Keiko's expression the previous day had awakened a sense of shared humanity that he could not ignore. When Keiko discovered the rose hours later, her initial reaction was fear. She looked around frantically, wondering if this was some kind of trap or test. But as she leaned closer, studying the careful way the stem had been wrapped to preserve moisture, the deliberate placement that made it a gift rather than an accident, something shifted inside her chest. Someone had seen her looking at the flowers. Someone had cared enough to bring her one. In that moment, the wall between enemy and human began to show its first hairline crack. The rose on Keiko's fence post did not go unnoticed. By midday, every woman in the compound had heard about it, and theories spread through hushed conversations during work assignments. Some believed it was a cruel joke, that the flower would somehow be used against them. Others thought it might be a sign of disrespect, though no one could quite articulate how. A few, like Keiko herself, allowed themselves to wonder if it might simply be what it appeared to be, an act of kindness from an unexpected source. Private Martinez was not the only guard whose perspective had begun to shift during those cold December days. Corporal David Wilson, a rancher's son from Odessa, had been watching how the women worked in the camp kitchen, their movements efficient and careful despite the unfamiliar ingredients and equipment. He noticed one woman in particular, Yuki Tanaka, who seemed to have a natural talent for cooking, somehow transforming the basic military rations into meals that were almost palatable. On impulse, he brought a smooth river stone from his family's property, one that his mother had always used as a paperweight. He left it on the windowsill of the kitchen where Yuki worked, a small object of beauty in an otherwise utilitarian space. When Yuki found the stone, polished smooth by centuries of water, she held it in her palm and felt tears prick her eyes. In Japanese culture, such stones were treasured, collected, and displayed as reminders of nature's patient artistry. That someone here understood this, or had at least intuited it, seemed impossible, and yet here was the proof in her hand. Sergeant Thomas Blackwater took a different approach to bridging the divide. During his patrols, he began speaking simple English words and pointing to objects, teaching vocabulary without fanfare or official sanction. Tree, he would say, pointing beyond the fence. Sky. Bird. Cloud. Some of the women ignored him, but others, including Keiko, began to listen and repeat the words softly, testing the strange sounds on their tongues. Blackwater understood what it meant to have your language treated as inferior or suspicious. During the war, his Navajo tongue had become a weapon for America, an unbreakable code that confounded the enemy. But before the war, he had been punished in boarding schools for speaking his native language. He knew that language was more than communication. It was connection, identity, and power. By teaching these women English, he was offering them a tool for survival and understanding. Other guards began leaving their own small gifts. A hand-carved wooden bird appeared on a fence post. A handful of pecans in a clean cloth. A sketch of the desert landscape drawn on a scrap of paper. Each gift was left anonymously, though the women began to recognize patterns and suspect which guards might be responsible. The gifts created a strange new dynamic in the camp. The women found themselves looking at their captors with confusion rather than pure fear. These cowboys and ranchers did not fit the image of merciless American soldiers they had been taught to expect. Instead, they seemed almost as uncertain about this situation as the prisoners themselves, reaching across the divide in the only ways they knew how. December 24, 1944. Colonel Harrison had wrestled with how to handle Christmas in a camp housing prisoners who did not celebrate the holiday. His superiors had given him little guidance on managing female Japanese prisoners, and he found himself making decisions based more on instinct than protocol. He finally decided to allow a modest celebration, reasoning that maintaining morale among both prisoners and guards was essential for camp security. The women were given permission to use materials from the craft supply room to create simple decorations. At first they worked in confused silence, unsure why their captors would allow them to participate in an American holiday. But as they cut paper into shapes and strung popcorn on thread, something unexpected began to happen. The work reminded them of festivals back home, of preparing decorations for Tanabata and New Year celebrations with their families. Keiko found herself working alongside Sergeant Blackwater, who was helping to string lights in the mess hall. He spoke to her in his careful, simple English, pointing to objects and naming them. Light, star, tree. She repeated the words, her pronunciation improving with each attempt. Then, hesitantly, she pointed to the same objects and offered the Japanese words, Hikari, Hoshi, Ki. For the first time since her capture, she was teaching rather than just receiving instruction, and the shift in dynamic felt profound. As evening approached, the mess hall had been transformed. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, strings of popcorn and cranberries draped across the walls, and a small pine tree that one of the ranchers had brought from his property stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments. When the women gathered for the evening meal, they found tables laden with a feast that the kitchen staff had spent days preparing, including a turkey that Private Wilson had somehow procured from a local farm. After the meal, Colonel Harrison stood and gave a brief speech about peace and goodwill, his words translated haltingly by Sergeant Blackwater, who had been studying Japanese phrases from a military handbook. Then, in a moment that surprised everyone, including herself, Keiko stood up. Her heart pounded as she addressed the room in her careful English. "We sing for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Japanese song and American song, we try." The women gathered at the front of the room, their voices tentative at first, as they sang a traditional Japanese folk song about snow falling on distant mountains. The melody was haunting and beautiful, filled with longing for home and family. Even those who could not understand the words felt the weight of emotion behind them. Then, they attempted Silent Night in English. Their pronunciation was imperfect, the words unfamiliar on their tongues, but the sincerity of their effort was unmistakable. Jake Martinez felt his throat tighten as he listened. These were the same women who had arrived 6 weeks earlier, rigid with fear and defiance. Now they stood singing Christmas carols to their captors, offering a bridge across a chasm that had seemed impossible to cross. In that moment the war felt very far away, and the possibility of shared humanity felt, suddenly, impossibly near. January 1945 brought bitter cold to the Texas desert, and with it, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of the camp. The Christmas celebration had opened a door that neither side seemed willing to close. Conversations between guards and prisoners became more frequent, conducted in a pidgin mixture of English, Japanese, and elaborate hand gestures that often ended in mutual laughter at the absurdity of their miscommunications. Keiko had emerged as the unofficial translator for the group, her English improving rapidly through her daily exchanges with Sergeant Blackwater and the other guards who had taken an interest in teaching her. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for languages, something her rigid education in Japan had never allowed her to explore. More importantly, she found herself genuinely curious about these American cowboys who seemed so different from the propaganda images she had been fed during her military training. Private Martinez had taken to spending his break times near the fence, where Keiko often stood during recreation periods. Their conversations were halting at first, limited by vocabulary and cultural understanding, but they persisted. He told her about his family's ranch, about growing up between two cultures, speaking Spanish at home and English at school, never quite belonging fully to either world. She listened with an intensity that made him self-conscious, but also encouraged him to share more. In turn, Keiko began to share fragments of her own story. She spoke of Yokohama, of the harbor where ships came and went carrying goods from around the world, of her father who had worked as a clerk in a shipping company, and her mother who had taught ikebana, the art of flower arrangement. She described her younger brother, who had wanted to become an engineer, and her sister, who had loved to draw. She did not know if any of them were still alive, a reality that hung between her words like a weight too heavy to fully acknowledge. One afternoon, Martinez brought a small photograph from his wallet, creased and worn from being carried in his pocket. It showed his family standing in front of their ranch house, his parents, 3 sisters, and 2 brothers, all squinting into the sun with expressions of casual affection. Keiko studied the image with careful attention, noting how his mother stood with her hand on his father's shoulder, how his youngest sister grinned gap-toothed at the camera. "Family," Martinez said simply, and Keiko nodded, understanding that this single word carried the weight of everything they both missed, everything this war had stolen from millions of people on both sides of the conflict. The next day, Keiko brought her own treasure to the fence. From a hidden pocket in her uniform, she withdrew a small photograph, its edges frayed from constant handling. It showed 4 people standing in a formal pose before a painted backdrop, the stiff formality typical of Japanese studio portraits. Her family, frozen in time, before the war had torn their world apart. Martinez looked at the photograph with the same careful attention she had given his, and in that moment of shared vulnerability, the wall between enemy and human crumbled a little more. February 1945 brought news that shattered what fragile peace the women had found within the camp's confines. Reports from the Pacific Theater grew increasingly grim as American forces advanced closer to the Japanese home islands. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of February 25 killed an estimated 100,000 civilians, most of them women, children, and elderly people, who had no connection to the military machine that had driven their country into war. Keiko learned of the bombing through an American newspaper that Sergeant Blackwater had quietly left in the library, a small room that had been set up for the prisoners to use during their limited free time. The grainy photographs showed entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, survivors wandering through smoking ruins with expressions of shell-shocked disbelief. Her hands trembled as she read the accompanying text, translating the English words slowly, hoping somehow that she had misunderstood. But there was no misunderstanding the images of destruction that sprawled across the pages. Yokohama, her home city, had been bombed weeks earlier. She had received no letters from her family since October, a silence that she had tried to interpret as merely the chaos of war disrupting mail delivery. Now she was forced to confront a darker possibility that her family might be among the countless dead, buried in rubble or burned beyond recognition. She sat alone in the library for hours, the newspaper spread before her, unable to move or think beyond the image of her mother's flower shop. The small building where she had learned to arrange chrysanthemums and cherry blossoms, now likely nothing more than scattered ash. Other women gathered around her as word of the bombing spread through the compound. Yuki Tanaka discovered that Osaka, her hometown, had suffered similar devastation. Michiko Sato learned that Nagoya, where her parents and 3 younger siblings lived, had been targeted in multiple raids. The women clung to each other, weeping openly in a way they had not allowed themselves since their capture. The grief was compounded by a terrible helplessness. They were thousands of miles away, unable to search for survivors or offer comfort to those who remained. The guards witnessed this collective anguish with discomfort and unexpected compassion. These were the same men who had lost friends and brothers in the Pacific, who had every reason to celebrate American victories and Japanese losses. Yet watching the women grieve, Private Martinez found no satisfaction in their pain. He saw only young women mourning their families, their tears no different than the tears his own mother would shed if their ranch were destroyed and her children killed. That evening, without prompting from commanders or official sanction, several guards brought small offerings to the women's barracks: extra blankets, hot tea, a plate of cookies that Corporal Wilson's mother had sent from home. They said nothing, simply left these gifts and retreated, recognizing that some sorrows were too deep for words or gestures to truly address. Keiko accepted a cup of tea from Martinez with shaking hands, meeting his eyes briefly before looking away. In that moment, she understood something fundamental had shifted. Her captors were grieving with her, acknowledging her loss as real and worthy of compassion, even though their countries remained locked in mortal combat. March 1945 brought a different kind of devastation, one that struck not at the women's homes but at the very foundation of their beliefs. As American forces liberated territories across the Pacific, reports began emerging about Japanese military conduct during the war. Stories of the Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners had been forced to march 65 miles in scorching heat with minimal food or water, many dying or being executed along the way. Accounts of prisoner of war camps where Allied soldiers had been starved, tortured, and worked to death. Testimonies from civilians in occupied territories describing systematic brutality and atrocities committed by Japanese forces. Keiko sat in the library surrounded by newspapers and military reports that Sergeant Blackwater had made available, though she suspected he had done so with great reluctance. The documents painted a picture of her country's military that contradicted everything she had believed about honor, duty, and the righteousness of Japan's cause. She had been taught that Japan was defending itself against Western imperialism, that their soldiers fought with honor and treated enemies with respect, according to Bushido, the warrior code. But these reports told a different story entirely. They described deliberate cruelty, systematic dehumanization, and a level of brutality that made her physically ill to read. She thought about the young soldiers she had worked alongside in the communications unit, boys barely old enough to shave who spoke reverently about serving the emperor and protecting their homeland. Had they known about these atrocities? Had they participated in them? And more troubling, what did it mean that she herself had served this same military machine, intercepting Allied communications that might have led to the capture and mistreatment of enemy soldiers? Yuki found her there, tears streaming down her face as she stared at a photograph of emaciated Allied prisoners liberated from a camp in the Philippines. "Keiko," she whispered in Japanese, her voice breaking, "is this who we were? Is this what we served?" Other women gathered, drawn by the sound of weeping. They passed the newspapers between them with trembling hands, each woman confronting the same shattering realization. They had believed they were serving their country's defense, protecting their families and homeland. Instead, they had been part of something monstrous, cogs in a machine that had committed unspeakable acts in the name of the emperor they had been taught to revere as divine. Michiko Sato, who had always been the most defiant of the prisoners, maintaining her military bearing even in captivity, collapsed against the wall and sobbed. "I did not know," she kept repeating in Japanese. "I did not know." But ignorance felt like a hollow excuse. Should they have known? Should they have questioned? The propaganda had been so complete, so pervasive, that questioning had never seemed possible. But now, sitting in this American prison camp, treated with more dignity than their own military had shown its captives. They were forced to confront the possibility that everything they had believed about their country and themselves had been a carefully constructed lie. That night, Keiko wrote in her diary in shaking handwriting, "What kind of people were we? What kind of person was I? I thought I knew honor. I thought I understood duty. Now I understand nothing except that I served evil while believing it was good." The women's anguish did not go unnoticed in the surrounding community. Word had spread through Fort Stockton about the Japanese prisoners at the camp, and opinions were sharply divided. At the local diner, ranchers and townspeople debated whether enemy captives deserved any sympathy at all. Some families who had lost sons in the Pacific demanded that the prisoners be treated with the harshness they felt Japanese forces had shown American soldiers. Letters to the editor of the Fort Stockton Pioneer appeared weekly, some calling for stricter conditions, others questioning why women prisoners were even being held on American soil. But not everyone shared this view. Rosa Martinez, Jake's mother, had been quietly gathering information about the women through her son's letters and occasional visits home. She learned that many were educated, that they had been conscripted into service rather than volunteering, that they were struggling with the revelations about their country's actions with what appeared to be genuine horror and remorse. Rosa knew something about being judged for circumstances beyond her control. Her own family had faced discrimination as Mexican Americans, treated as perpetual foreigners despite having lived in Texas for generations. She understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy, simply because of where you came from or the language you spoke. One Sunday after Mass, she approached Father Patrick O'Connor with a proposal. "These women need guidance," she told the priest. "They need to understand that acknowledging the truth does not mean they are beyond redemption." Father O'Connor was initially hesitant. The political implications of a Catholic priest offering spiritual counsel to Japanese prisoners were significant. But Rosa was persistent, and she was joined in her appeal by Maria Gonzalez, whose husband worked as a guard at the camp, and by Sarah Blackwater, Sergeant Blackwater's aunt, a Navajo woman who had been running a trading post near town for 20 years. These three women represented different communities that had their own complicated relationships with mainstream America. They understood what the Japanese women were experiencing in ways that others could not. They knew what it meant to be seen as other, to carry the burden of collective blame for actions you did not personally commit. Together, they petitioned Colonel Harrison for permission to visit the camp as part of a community outreach program. The colonel, who had been wrestling with how to handle the prisoners' psychological state, saw potential value in the proposal. If these women could help stabilize the prisoners' mental health, it might prevent more serious problems. The first visit occurred on a warm afternoon in late March. Rosa, Maria, and Sarah arrived at the camp carrying baskets of food, Spanish and English language books, and simple craft supplies. Through Keiko's translation, they introduced themselves and explained their purpose. "We are not here to judge," Rosa said, her words translated carefully by Keiko. "We are here because we recognize what it means to lose your sense of who you are. We want to help you find your way forward." The Japanese women listened with expressions of cautious hope. For the first time since learning the truth about their country's actions, they were being offered something besides pity or condemnation. They were being offered understanding from those who knew what it meant to rebuild an identity from broken pieces. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across America, church bells ringing, and crowds filling the streets in jubilation. At Fort Stockton, the news was met with more subdued acknowledgement. The war in Europe had ended, but the Pacific Theater continued its brutal progression toward the Japanese home islands. For the women prisoners, the German surrender carried a different significance. It meant the war was entering its final phase, and with it came the question of what would happen to them when Japan inevitably fell. Repatriation procedures had already begun for German prisoners across the country. Transport ships were being organized, processing centers established, and thousands of former enemy soldiers were preparing to return to their defeated homeland. But the situation for the 38 Japanese women at Fort Stockton remained unclear. Officials in Washington debated their status in memos that went back and forth without reaching any definitive conclusion. The women themselves faced an agonizing question that kept them awake through the warm spring nights. What were they returning to? Reports from the Pacific painted an increasingly desperate picture. American submarines had strangled Japan's supply lines, leaving the population facing severe food shortages. Cities continued to burn under incendiary bombing raids. The government was preparing civilian populations for a final apocalyptic defense of the home islands, training women and children to fight with bamboo spears against an invasion force. Keiko had received one letter from Japan in April, forwarded through the International Red Cross after months of delays. It was from a neighbor in Yokohama, written in shaking characters that suggested the writer was elderly or ill. The letter confirmed Keiko's worst fears. Her family's home had been destroyed in the bombing. Her father had been killed instantly. Her mother and sister were missing, likely dead, though their bodies had never been found. Her brother had been conscripted into the army and sent to Okinawa, where brutal fighting was currently underway. The neighbor wrote that she had no hope he would survive. "I am sorry to bring such terrible news," the letter concluded. "Your mother asked me, before she disappeared, to tell you if I could, that she loved you and did not blame you for leaving. She understood you were doing your duty." Keiko read the letter alone in the library, then carefully folded it and placed it in her diary next to the photograph of her family. She felt hollow, emptied out, as if grief had carved away everything inside her and left only a shell behind. When she finally emerged, she found Yuki waiting for her with an expression that suggested she had received similar news. They did not speak, simply sat together in silent acknowledgement of shared loss. Over the following days, more letters arrived, each bringing variations of the same story. Families dead or missing, homes destroyed, cities in ruins. Of the 38 women in the camp, only 7 received any news that offered hope of finding family members alive. The others faced the prospect of returning to a country where no one waited for them, where even the landscape of their memories had been reduced to ash and rubble. Meanwhile, life in the camp continued its strange evolution from captivity toward something approaching community. June 15, 1945. Colonel Harrison stood before the assembled women in the camp's main hall, holding official documents from the War Department. The telegram had arrived that morning, and he had spent hours considering how to deliver the news. His voice was steady but carried an undertone of compassion that the women had learned to recognize over the past 7 months. "Ladies," he began, waiting for Keiko to translate his words into Japanese. "I have received orders regarding your repatriation to Japan. The war in the Pacific is drawing to a close. Transportation will be arranged within the next few weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps before being released to return to your homes or to whatever locations you choose within Japan." He paused, observing the mixture of relief and dread on their faces. Some women nodded with resignation, having expected this announcement for weeks. Others looked down at their hands, unable to meet his gaze. What no one expected was what happened next. Keiko Yamamoto stood slowly, her hands visibly shaking. In clear, careful English that reflected months of practice and determination, she addressed the colonel directly. "Colonel Harrison, may I speak for some of us?" Permission granted. Keiko looked around at her fellow prisoners, meeting the eyes of the women who had spent countless nights discussing this moment, debating what they would do when it finally arrived. Yuki Tanaka stood next, followed by Michiko Sato, then 9 others. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, their decision clearly made. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks," Keiko said, her voice gaining strength despite her trembling. "Some of us do not wish to return to Japan immediately." The words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. Private Martinez, standing guard at the back of the room, felt his breath catch. Colonel Harrison's expression shifted from routine announcement to complete bewilderment. Yuki spoke next in halting English, each word carefully chosen. "Colonel, We know what we are asking is unusual, but Japan is not our home anymore. The country we served, we discovered it was not the country we believed in." She gestured to the newspapers that still lay on tables throughout the room, the evidence of their country's actions that had shattered their understanding of everything they had fought for. "Here," Michiko added, her usually defiant voice soft with emotion, "we have learned what it means to be treated with dignity, even as enemies. We have seen kindness where we expected cruelty." Colonel Harrison was momentarily speechless. In his 22 years of military service, he had encountered many unexpected situations, but never had he faced prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept their freedom. He asked for clarification, and what followed was an outpouring of emotion that revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. They spoke of families that no longer existed, of cities reduced to rubble, of a future in Japan that offered nothing but starvation and chaos. But more than that, they spoke of what they had found in this unlikely place, in a Texas prison camp surrounded by cowboys and desert roses. The women's unprecedented request sent shockwaves far beyond the camp's barbed wire fences. Within days, the story had been picked up by newspapers across Texas and then spread to the national press. Headlines ranged from the sensational to the sympathetic. The Dallas Morning News ran, "Japanese prisoners refuse freedom," while the San Antonio Express offered a more nuanced, "Enemy captives seek new beginning in Texas." The Fort Stockton Pioneer became ground zero for the debate, its letters to the editor section exploding with opinions from every direction. Harold McMurphy, who had lost 2 nephews at Iwo Jima, wrote a scathing letter demanding that the prisoners be sent back immediately. "These women served the same evil empire that killed our boys," he wrote. "They don't deserve special treatment or the privilege of staying on American soil." But other voices rose in counterpoint. Rosa Martinez wrote her own letter, describing the transformation she had witnessed during her visits to the camp. "I have met these women," she wrote. "I have seen their genuine remorse and their desire to build better lives. Turning them away would be turning our backs on the very values that make America worth defending." Father O'Connor used his Sunday sermon to address the controversy, speaking about mercy, redemption, and the parable of the prodigal son. "If we cannot offer forgiveness to those who genuinely seek it," he told his congregation, "then we become as rigid and unforgiving as the systems we fought against." The debate reached beyond the local level. Wire services picked up the story, and soon, newspapers in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles were running features about the Japanese women who wanted to stay in Texas. Radio commentators discussed the case on evening broadcasts. Some framed it as a heartwarming story of American generosity and the power of democratic values to transform even enemies. Others saw it as dangerous precedent, questioning whether enemy nationals should be allowed to remain in the country while American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific. Legal experts weighed in on the complicated question of their status. Technically, as prisoners of war, they were entitled to repatriation under the Geneva Convention. But the convention did not address what should happen if prisoners refused repatriation. Could they be forced to return? If they stayed, what would their legal status be? They could not remain prisoners indefinitely, but transitioning them to any other immigration category presented its own challenges. Meanwhile, unexpected allies continued to emerge. The Henderson family, whose ranch bordered the camp property, offered to sponsor Keiko, providing housing and employment as a translator and tutor for their 3 children. Dr. William Foster, who ran the hospital in Fort Stockton, heard about Yuki's work with the camp medical officer and offered her a position as a nursing assistant, promising to help her pursue formal certification. Other local families, moved by the women's story and their obvious sincerity, began stepping forward. The Johnsons offered to sponsor Michiko, who had skills as a seamstress. The Williamson family, who owned a small hotel in town, said they could provide room and board in exchange for work. Each offer represented not just practical support, but a willingness to see past national identity to recognize individual humanity. July 8, 1945. The response from Washington had finally arrived, characteristically bureaucratic but unexpectedly flexible. The War Department would not prevent the repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return immediately. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Japan, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. The decision meant that the women would no longer be prisoners of war, but they also would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at the camp. They would need to find sponsors, employment, and housing in American communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. It was, in many ways, a more daunting prospect than simply returning to Japan with all expenses paid and logistics handled by the military. The announcement divided the 12 women who had originally requested to stay. For 3 days they debated among themselves in hushed conversations during meals and recreation periods. The weight of the decision pressed down on all of them. Choosing to stay meant cutting ties with everything they had known, gambling on an uncertain future in a foreign land. But choosing to return meant facing devastation, possible starvation, and the stigma of having been captured by the enemy. 5 of the 12 ultimately decided that the uncertainty was too great. Akiko Suzuki, who had been among the most enthusiastic about staying, received a letter from the Red Cross, informing her that her mother had survived the bombings and was living in a refugee center in Hiroshima. Despite the hardship that awaited her, Akiko could not abandon her mother. "I must go back," she told Keiko through tears. "She has no one else." 3 others made similar decisions. Reiko Yamada had learned that her younger siblings were alive and living with an uncle in Kyoto. Hana Watanabe discovered that her husband, who she had believed was dead, was actually in an Allied prisoner of war camp in the Philippines and would soon be repatriated. Fumiko Nakamura simply could not imagine building a life so far from everything and everyone she had ever known, even if that world had been reduced to ruins. But 7 women, led by Keiko and Yuki, chose to accept the challenge of starting completely new lives in America. The process of finalizing sponsors and arrangements took another 2 weeks. The Henderson family officially agreed to sponsor Keiko, filing the necessary paperwork with immigration authorities. Dr. Foster completed arrangements for Yuki. One by one, the other women found families or businesses willing to vouch for them and provide initial support. The same communities that had initially been suspicious of having Japanese prisoners nearby now embraced the opportunity to participate in what they saw as a uniquely American story of redemption and second chances. Perhaps the most significant development was the decision made by several women who had chosen repatriation. On the evening before the transport was scheduled to leave, they gathered with those who were staying. Akiko spoke for the group, her words translated by Keiko for the American staff who had gathered to say goodbye. "We return to Japan not as defeated prisoners, but as ambassadors of the reconciliation we have experienced here. We will carry back the lessons we have learned about forgiveness and the possibility of former enemies becoming friends." The final repatriation day arrived on July 26, 1945. The scene at Fort Stockton was unlike anything in the history of American prisoner of war operations. Instead of the usual tense, formal processing of defeated enemies being returned to their homeland, the atmosphere resembled a community farewell gathering tinged with both hope and sorrow. The 31 women who had chosen repatriation stood ready for departure, but their military bearing had softened completely over the months. They carried with them letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff. More importantly, they carried a different understanding of what America represented. Colonel Harrison addressed the departing women with words that he later said were among the most difficult of his military career. "You came here as our enemies," he told them, his voice thick with emotion, "but you leave as something we never expected, as friends. I hope you will remember that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest of times." Keiko, now officially transitioning from prisoner to immigrant, stood to respond on behalf of those remaining. Her English had become fluent and confident. "Colonel Harrison, we came here believing we knew what America was. We learned that we knew nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that the only real enemy was our own ignorance and hatred. The women embraced each other with tears flowing freely, no longer constrained by the rigid discipline that had defined their early days in captivity. Akiko pressed a small origami crane into Keiko's hand, a symbol of hope and healing. "Remember us," she whispered in Japanese. "Remember that some of us went back to help rebuild what was broken." Keiko clutched the paper crane and nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. As the transport vehicles pulled away, those remaining waved until the trucks disappeared into the heat shimmer of the desert horizon. Then they turned to face their new lives with mixture of determination and uncertainty. The transition from prisoners to immigrants proved challenging, but rewarding. Keiko moved into a small cottage on the Henderson property and began working as a translator and tutor. Her unique perspective as someone who had been on both sides of the conflict made her invaluable for families trying to understand the complex aftermath of the war. She helped process letters for other Japanese immigrants, translated documents for military officials, and taught Japanese language and culture to students who would later become part of the occupation forces. Yuki thrived in the hospital environment under Dr. Foster's mentorship. She studied at night, took certification exams, and within 3 years became a fully licensed nurse. Her story became locally famous, and she was often invited to speak to community groups about forgiveness and transformation. She never married, dedicating her life instead to caring for others as a way of making amends for her country's actions during the war. Though she had personally committed no crime beyond serving in the military of her birth, 25 years after that unprecedented day when Japanese women prisoners begged to remain in American captivity, Keiko Yamamoto Henderson stood before a gathering in Fort Stockton. The old camp had long since been dismantled, but the community had erected a small memorial on the site, and she had been invited to speak at its dedication ceremony. Now an American citizen with 2 grown children, she carried with her a small leather diary, the same one she had clutched when she first arrived at the camp, and a faded origami crane that Akiko had pressed into her hand the day they parted. Her speech that warm June afternoon in 1970 would be remembered by those present as one of the most moving testimonies they had ever heard about the possibility of peace between former enemies. She spoke about the morning when Colonel Harrison announced their freedom to return to Japan, and how that announcement had forced them to confront the most important question of their lives. What did home truly mean? "We discovered," she told the audience gathered under the Texas sun, "that home is not just where you come from. It is where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature rather than the worst. We found that forgiveness is not something that is given to you. It is something you earn through your actions and your commitment to being better than you were before." Jake Martinez stood in the crowd, now a grandfather himself, his hair gray at the temples and his face weathered by decades of ranch work. He caught Keiko's eye and smiled, remembering the scared young man he had been when he first left a rose on a fence post, not knowing that small gesture would become part of something much larger than himself. After the ceremony, Keiko and Jake walked together to the exact spot where the fence line had once stood. They carried rose bushes donated by Rosa Martinez, Jake's mother, who had passed away 2 years earlier, but whose commitment to compassion had inspired a generation. Together, they planted the roses along an imaginary line where barbed wire once divided enemies. The story of the Japanese women who chose to stay had become more than historical curiosity. It had become a symbol of America's capacity for redemption and renewal, proof that even in the darkest times, people could choose to see past their hatred, to recognize the humanity in their enemies. Yuki, now Dr. Yuki Tanaka Foster, having taken her sponsor's name after his death, left her his practice, had maintained correspondence with the women who returned to Japan. Letters had flowed across the Pacific for decades, creating a network of women united by their shared experience of transformation. Those who returned often wrote about the challenges of rebuilding their lives in post-war Japan, but also about how their experience in America had given them hope and resilience that sustained them through the difficult years of occupation and reconstruction. As Keiko placed the last rose bush in the ground, she held up her worn diary. In this diary, she said, "I wrote the questions that every person must answer for themselves. Who am I? What do I believe in? What kind of person do I choose to become?" The remarkable thing about America is that it gave me the freedom to discover that I could choose different answers than the ones I had been given.